Hey, I'm Harrison, and I'm back with another historical lecture on the history of money creation from Stephen Zarlenga's book, The Lost Science of Money. And I heard there were some technical issues with the last lecture on Charlemagne and Venice. So I'll give a quick little review about that before we launch into tonight's lecture about the Crusades, the birth of the Knights Templar, and things get a little bit more interesting. This is where some of the conspiracies start. How we doing on sound and audio and everything? Everything looking good?
So far, no one's complaining.
All right, good. So, just to give a quick review of the history so far from the Lost Science of Money, what we see, early money, ancient money, was alive. It consisted of cows or grain or tools in some cases as well. And what we see is that gold started to become used as currency, gold and silver, sometime around 1500 to 1000 BC. And the Greek temples played a big important role in monetizing gold and silver. Before, like I said, animals or seeds would be loaned out, and it was common when making loans of animals or seeds to return some of the extra offspring or some of the harvests that were produced. And that tradition of giving some of the interest back to the lender started to carry over with metal, with money. However, money is of course barren. It can't reproduce itself. It can't have sex with other money and create new money. And Zarlenga calls this the usury era. And we started to see this happen, around 15 to 1000 BC. And this caused a lot of problems. There's a lot of civil war within and between city-states. In last week's lecture, I brought up the Greek play Antigone by Sophocles, who was writing in the year 450, 400 BC, something. I'm bad with years. I'm trying to get better with years. I'm better at memorizing the stories. But Sophocles' story is one about civil war. Again, Antigone is the daughter of Oedipus, who is discussion about the Oedipus complex, but Oedipus was someone who was cursed to bring doom to the city of Thebes. He was abandoned as a child because he was prophesied to bring doom. And then he comes back, he answers the riddle of the Sphinx, goes on to Thebes, accidentally murders his father, becomes the king of Thebes for solving the Sphinx's riddle at this point, and then winds up marrying his mother and having some kids, one of them being Antigone. After Oedipus discovers what he had done, he blinds himself, his wife kills himself, and then things get messed up. Eteocles stays loyal to Thebes, Polynices joins some other city, I forget which. There's a big civil war, and both brothers are killed. And so then King Creon forbids Polynices from being buried. And Antigone, whose name means born against, she's clearly born to cause trouble, she decides that she has to bury her brother in spite of King Creon's decree. And so she buries him. King Creon decides she needs to be punished publicly. She refuses to repent. She talks about how the laws of the gods are more important than the decrees of humans, and the problem with this causes conflicts for Creon because Antigone is supposed to marry his son, Hammon. Hammon gets into a big fight with his dad, King Creon, and eventually Tiresias, the blind prophet who saved them in the beginning, he comes around and he warns Creon to allow this body of Polynices to be buried and to release Antigone from punishment because the city is turning against them. And this is the point at which we see another reference to the gold trading mechanism. Creon gets upset and accuses Tiresias, the blind prophet, the blind prophet, of seeking profit in monetary terms, and tells him to go to India where he can make a better profit in the gold trade. You can see this gold silver east-west mechanism, which was the original central bank. It was possible to change more silver in the west, usually like 12 to 1, as opposed to the east in places like India where it was closer to 6 to 1. Historically, it's fluctuated. But there was some awareness of this, and you can see this gold-silver trading mechanism, this early central bank, hovering over all these problems within ancient Thebes, according to Sophocles. So, that's just sort of a description of ancient Thebes. It gives us a sense of what ancient Greece was like when they were using gold as a form of currency. Not that unlike today. It's comparable to today. The Civil War, the family problems, and the monetary system. So, in Sparta, Lycurgus was called back sometime around the 8th century, and this is when he began to reform the Spartan monetary system. He, instead of using gold or silver or any kind of valuable commodity, what he did was he took iron bars, melted them down, soaked them in vinegar, and these pellinors became the main currency. Things in Sparta got better. There's a really good document on the history tab here. You can go, you'd have to dig through it, but it talks about how Spartans ate better food than everyone else in Greece. The description of the pellinors and the changes is coming to us from Plutarch, who was writing in, I believe, 100 AD about the changes that supposedly happened in Sparta. Crime went away, and the men had more time to focus on defense, focus on training and fitness and learning combat skills. And this, of course, was how they beat Xerxes, 300 Spartans, along with all their slaves. They had several hundred Helot slaves with them who were also helping them out. But this Spartan, the Pellinor system, probably influenced King Numa, the second king of Rome. This was, again, I think, also somewhat overlapping time period, 8th, 7th century BC. And again, help me out for Will, whoever else is out there, help me out with the dates, especially if you happen to have a copy of the Lost Science of Money. And so, King Numa was a descendant of the Sabines. The Sabines were a colony of the Spartans, so he most likely learned something about this lost science of money from them. And someone else, very quick point, someone else who learned something about this science too, after looking at all of these reforms, was Aristotle, who wrote in the Ethics that money exists by law, nomos, not by nature, not by commodity, or something like that. He talked about how anything could become money, how it had to do with trust. And this is something that we see confirmed with historical anthropology. Another really interesting book, David Graeber's book, talks about different forms of money in pre-modern societies. He talks about cowrie shells being used as currency in Africa, or, rusty nails in Ireland, or any number of things. Money didn't necessarily have the same importance, the same function that it has in this society, just like it did in Sparta, ancient Sparta. But when you have a publicly owned monetary system, history tells us that the significance of money becomes very different. And anyway, this is what happened in ancient Rome too. The strength of the Republic, according to Zarlenga, was based upon this bronze money that it used, this valueless bronze nomisma, it was termed, and this served the Republic fairly well until it got locked into the Punic Wars. Same thing, the Punic Wars, and I believe 200 BC's 260 something BC. And Zarlenga talks about the same thing happening in Sparta. When Sparta got locked into wars of conquest, that's when they started looking for silver and gold, and their iron pellinors weren't useless. But that worked for Sparta for about 3.5 centuries. So, similar experience in ancient Rome. From 800 BC, 700 BC, roughly up until about 260 BC, it worked out. But then Hannibal's elephants start trampling around Rome, gobbling up all that money, that bronze money, using it against Rome. And this is when Rome gets locked into using a silver monetary currency system. Even after the Punic Wars ended, even after they took care of Carthage, they went right back to war. So, ancient evidence suggesting that the old bankers, showing the correlations between banking and war. All wars are bankers' wars, and this has always been true. The monetary instability continued through Julius Caesar, the Civil War, around 60 and 400 BC. And then, by the time that Constantinian moved the capital from Rome to Constantinople to be closer to the Orient, to Asia, 331 BC, we still, so this was important, 331 BC. We still see systems of gold and silver being used, but Constantine moved the capital closer to Asia, where the gold-silver exchange ratio was less than compared to the west of Europe. The other important thing that happened with this move is that the office of the Pontificus Maximus, the early pope, which had the highest sacred prerogatives, they regulated the calendar, and they also were the only people who could make gold coin. Local rulers in Europe could mint silver, but they couldn't mint gold. That was the prerogative of the Pontificus Maximus. So in 331 BC, this also moved further east, further away from Western Europe to Constantinople, and it became called the Basileus. And Zarlenga suggests that this is actually one of the real motivations for the Crusades. It wasn't really about retaking the Holy Land, and we're going to talk about that a little bit more what evidence there is that suggests that the Crusades had bigger motivations than just religious ones. It was monetary. And then, of course, we'll talk about how the Knights Templar organization evolved out of the Crusades, and how a lot of modern banking stuff evolved out of Templar innovations. Before that, though, before we move on to cover this next chapter about the Crusades and the Templars, though, please, if you can afford to, please donate to keep these lectures coming. Again, it takes a lot of research to put all this stuff together, and it's important that we know this stuff, though. We're doomed to repeat the mistakes of the past unless we figure them out, unless we study it. And again, I'm not asking you for your money for nothing. This is all about funding and the work that we need to do in order to actually create a solution to the end of this economic crisis that's been stifling all of our lives. And we're not out here teaching history just sharing this history for the sake of enjoying it, which we are in the short run. But again, the purpose of this history supports a very clear solution in terms of monetary reform, which has been crystallized with the National Emergency Employment Defense Act, which is a bill that was created by Dennis Kucinich, his wife, Elizabeth Kucinich, who used to work with Stephen Zarlenga, who both read this book and then got the NEAT Act drafted and passed through judicial review. And this bill would take over the central banking mechanism, the modern day East-West gold exchange rate. I can't wait to talk about the Fed, modern banking, when we start getting those chapters. But this would take over the central bank. And now, instead of money coming into the economy through the top down, trickle down economics, now the Fed would be forced to spend money into existence directly on an economic recovery, directly on debt forgiveness, student, medical, credit card, housing, you name it, would be done. This bill would probably mean the end of all utility bills. This bill would also set up public housing assistance for people who need it. This bill would set up universal education, universal health care, Green New Energy Project, updating our infrastructure, livable wages to pay for all the jobs associated with that, and fully funded political elections as well. All this nonsense about the Trump election, the Russian investigations. I heard that Senator Warren just read into Trump's health care bill. This bill changes the game. So we're sharing this history ultimately in order to raise awareness for why this bill is so important. And again, if you can donate to me to help me spread this work, great. The more money you can donate, the more time I will have to focus on this. And believe me, this is just the beginning. Getting these chapters out is just the start. Once we're done covering this history, then these updates will turn into more of a news format. We start talking about current monetary news and how that relates to the past, of course. And then the other component is that we'll have more time for actual organizing, actual direct action. There's very pleased to announce again that we have another public discussion on this book at the New School for Social Research. That's coming up on Wednesday, July 27th?
21st.
21st. Yeah. Thank you, Natalie. So much. Again, I'm bad with dates. But that'll be from 8 to 10 at the New School, 6 East 16th Street, 9th floor, Sociology Department. Hope to have as many people in there as we can. Bring your own bottles of wine. It's cheaper, and we'll have a good time thinking and drinking about monetary science. So again, please afford to donate if you can, and if you can't, please share this lecture out. Please spread the word about monetary history and the NEED Act, and please join us at the New School on the 21st. So anyway, moving on. Crusades and the monetary instability that went along with it, and the results being the Knights Templar. So, I'm going to blast through a little bit of this. Here's a quick timeline of the Crusades, and from 632 to 661, the Muslim conquests of Jerusalem went down. And 1095, 1099, the Seljuk Turks are threatening Byzantium. Again, remember, Byzantium is kind of isolated out there, close to the Orient, as it used to be called. And Byzantium relied upon Charlemagne for military strength in order to keep the barbarians at the gates, so to speak. Charlemagne is often heralded as one of the forebears of the Renaissance. Zarlenga dispels that notion. He points out that Charlemagne was a brief blip in the Dark Ages because of all the warfare and the slavery that he caused. Charlemagne's war-based economy and monetary system mostly sent silver east out of his empire to Constantinople, who allowed him to be emperor, but he still didn't get the prerogative of minting gold coins or anything like that. So, anyway, Constantinople has been in trouble for a while, and I think between them and Rome, this whole idea of getting Jerusalem back seemed like a good idea. And again, if you have any extra stuff to add on this period of history with the Crusades, please do, because this isn't quite my specialty, but the main points in terms of the monetary aspects are fairly clear. So, this is sort of the opening of the Crusades. The Knights Templar emerge from the First Crusade, and we're going to talk more about that. But they essentially arrive as a security force for other knights, and then eventually pilgrims who are taking, again, the early tourism industry. The Knights Templar protect pilgrims traveling along sites to the Holy Land. They make a lot of money off that. So the Second and Third Crusades are total failures to recapture Jerusalem. A lot of nasty, bloody episodes. But then by 1204, the fourth sack of Constantinople by the Pope and Venice. And this is weird. Like, why is Constantinople getting sacked? Like, I thought this was, like, wasn't the whole point to retake the Holy Land, according to the Pope. So this is where things get a little confusing, and this is where Zarlenga is suggesting the monetary impetus for the Crusades. And then we talked a little bit about Venice and their role in the Fourth Crusade. They're hesitant to join the Crusades in the beginning because they were on good terms with Muslims. The Muslims, Stephen Zarlenga spells it Muslims, so if anyone's confused about that pronunciation, that's why. But anyway, Muslims were helping Venice make lots of money. Venice tapped into that East-West trading mechanism, and they were getting a lot of the silver. They didn't quite figure out nomisma though. They cautiously introduced a nomisma, but they didn't give it enough value like the Romans did.
What was nomisma again, just to remind
you? Nomisma is value. Nomisma is money based on law. So it's money issued by a government, essentially, as opposed to money issued by temple priests based on gold or silver or something like that. So nomisma is it's just a means of exchange, as Aristotle said it should be.
That's what we're fighting for, pretty much.
That's what we're fighting for. The Need Act creates a modern form of nomisma.
That's cool.
Yes, it is cool. Good questions. Any other questions here while I kind of move up ahead a little? Alright, cool. So, the Crusades. In 1095, Pope Urban II passionately called for an expedition to take Jerusalem from the Muslims. It is the will of God, chanted the multitude. Every village in Europe was affected by this greatest undertaking of any kind since the imperial Rome. Millions went on the Crusades, many more millions of pilgrims followed them. The fervor was real, but such a great movement could not originate from popular desires in a world where the people, the populace, had so little to do with its own governments, after all. Muslims had ruled Palestine for over 400 years, and things were going okay. Christianity was allowed there. The Zarlenga points out that the Church of the Holy Sepulchre had been burnt down in 1009, but it had been rebuilt by 1048. Again, Turks are pressuring Byzantium. Byzantium is growing. You can kind of see here in this slide, I hope, how Turks are getting closer and closer to Byzantine.
Move to the right. There you go.
Another issue, another impetus in the Crusades, another factor, again, this is really complicated stuff, is the Jews and their control over a lot of the trade that the Knights Templar are eventually going to come to take over. So Zarlenga writes, the occupation of Spain by Islam had brought a wave of Jewish migration with it. Until the first half of the 8th century, the bulk of the Jewish people lived in Western Asia under Muslim rule. By the 11th century, most of the Jews had transferred from Asia to Europe. Pireni notes that much of East-West trade was in their hands through Spain. Another other influences, other impetus for the Crusades, again, Muslim invasions. There were growing princely ambitions as well. Economic and military position of the Western princes would be improved if they could retake the Holy Land and establish more direct trading relations of their own. So we're going to see later that there's a big massacre of Jews by Crusaders, and this is probably another monetary motivation, this desire to take over that trade. Papal ambitions, and this is kind of the big one here. So the papacy in Rome wanted to end the dominance of the Basilius, the new Pontificus Maximus, with all the power to issue gold, regulate time itself, the calendars, and the exchange between silver and gold, the ratio. So the papacy wanted to end the dominance of the Basilius, which was apparently still recognized as the supreme religious authority by most of the West's leadership. Retrieving Jerusalem with Western forces would strengthen the Pope's position, perhaps enough to dislodge the Byzantine establishment. Or if a large Western force could be moved near Constantinople without raising alarm, over the many years it would take to assemble, that force could ultimately be used to topple the emperor. That's Zarlenga's speculation that this was all about Constantinople all along, not Jerusalem. So, ultimately, the Crusades did achieve a monetary rebirth. It did open up new links with the East. Jerusalem was freed for 90 years. Muslims were pushed out of Spain forever, and the Jewish trade, which included the trade of slaves, was reduced. And this is an important part to keep in mind, this next part, which can get a little controversial. So, yeah. The Jews controlled, the Jews were getting pushed east-west, Zarlenga writes. So, they had connections, they had access, they had family networks to this east-west trading mechanism. They were able to, they did a lot of the slave trading for Charlemagne, for instance. And they brought lots of slaves from warfare in Western Europe through Spain to the Muslims. So, a primary activity that attracted the Jews into Europe in the 8th to the 11th century was to engage in the European slave trade. Parks notes that from the 5th to 8th century, Jewish traders continued and perhaps developed in the trade in slaves, but this activity only employed a relatively small proportion of the Jewish population. And of course, this was spurred by the Muslim occupation of Spain. Charlemagne apparently tolerated from the slave trade, as we insisted, and he also insisted that either a bishop or a count from the Catholic Church would be present at these slave trades. So, Zarlenga speculates that there's this big attack on Jews in 1096. He speculates that this was motivated in part by this slave trade. There were a lot of poor crusaders who gathered for the march to the Holy Land, and then they attacked them. And it's estimated that 800 Jews killed each other to avoid baptism. There were massacres at various cities. And, yeah. So, this is before the march even started. This is before they even, head out. They just start killing Jews. Forget about retaking the Holy Land. So, the Crusaders eventually reached Constantinople before they hit Jerusalem. They were impressed by the walls. The march to Jerusalem was very poorly planned. There was no food for the animals. Sheep, dogs, and even pigs were used as pack animals, Zarlenga writes. Desertions were heavy. The emperor had been advancing behind them to take possession of his new lands, but heard of their problems and turned back home to Constantinople. But on July 15th, in 1099, a group of Italian Genovese engineers built these movable towers with which they were able to take Jerusalem. When they arrived at Jerusalem, they were better off in Jerusalem than they were back in Europe. Long story short. The Crusaders found a much higher civilization than any to which they were accustomed, wrote Monroe, who noted that the Crusaders prospered in Palestine. Those who had a few coins here possessed countless bezants, and the Christians who were now in Jerusalem, they were doing so well. I mean, there were so many things to buy, new things that they hadn't had before: rice, coffee, sherbet. I don't know how they had that back then. Dates, apricots, lemons, sugar, spices, ginger, melon, rhubarb, dates. Household goods. They had mirrors, carpet, cloth, ships, compasses, writing. I mean, stuff that sounds minimal to us today. But this is people coming out of the Dark Ages into the Renaissance, essentially, or this is what spurred the Renaissance. New ideas like chess, Arabic, mathematics, pain-killing drugs. I wonder if that included cannabis. All sorts of stuff. All the Crusaders are finding all of these things. And they're doing okay. They're getting treated pretty well. And so they struck a new coin. There was a new coin created specifically for commerce with Crusaders. And so trade was going good. I mean, there was really no reason to war, but there was still lots of massacres. Pope Urban II still presented the Muslims negatively in spite of their superior lifestyle. He wrote that the Turk never ventures upon open close fight, as he has poisoned arrows, venom, not valor, inflicts death on the man he strikes. Whatever he effects then I attribute to fortune, not to courage. But the knights soon learned that no one could find more powerful or braver or more skillful warriors than they. The Saracens also developed an admiration for the Franks, and Noureddin called the Franks the bravest of mortals. Those were Charlemagne's fighters, apparently. So, Christian behavior contrasted really poorly with that of the Muslims. And Zarlenga has a lot to write about Saladin the Great. He was a Kurd born in Tikrit, and he had united the Muslims to fight the Crusaders. There's a story in The Lost Science of Money about how Saladin heard that Richard the Lionhearted was in town and didn't have a horse on which to fight Saladin himself, so Saladin sent him a really splendid charger. And there's stories about Saladin tearing up a camp to find lost children for a mother who was looking for his children. Talks about Saladin releasing thousands of captured prisoners. By way of contrast, Richard the Lionhearted, when he captured Acre, and he said, it's written, he slaughtered 2,700 Muslims in cold blood because the ransom he demanded was late. And his followers leapt forward to fulfill the command, thankful to the divine grace that permitted them to take such a vengeance. Saladin, by way of contrast, this is some advice he was giving his son. He said, "My son, I commend thee to the Most High God, the fountain of all goodness. Do his will, for that way lieth peace. Refrain from the shedding of blood. Trust not to that, for blood that is spilt never slumbers. Seek to win the hearts of thy people and watch over their prosperity, for it is to secure their happiness that thou art appointed by God, and by me." So the infidel that the Crusaders came into contact with turned out to be fairly likable to the Crusader. And in Asia Minor, many a pilgrim became a renegade to the Christian faith because of the good treatment received from Muslims. The common people said it was not necessary to capture cities for the Crusades because the Turks are better and more trustworthy than they who kept no faith with God or duty to neighbor, Roman Rome. This kind of heresy sprang up along all the routes to the Holy Land. So the Crusaders, even though they're invaders, they're always a small minority in the cities they conquered. And after a while, they took care to win the natives' goodwill, and they started intermarrying with the infidels. They became orientalized and didn't think much of home. There's talks about Christians who soon came to boast of being descendant of Muslims. Christian rulers often borrowed from superior doctors of Muslim rulers. And the Muslims, of course, had preserved elements of Greek and learning in Roman law than had been better preserved in the West. So, lots of conversion to Islam. And a lot of the Crusaders found reasons to question their faith. These discoveries of worldly powers and problems with the faith led to beginnings of a new freedom of mind in some individuals, which was transmitted through to the Knights Templar organization, which is what we'll talk about to end this. But, in the meantime, the sack of Constantinople is the culmination of the Fourth Crusade. And so things are getting confusing now. Byzantium had obstructed the Third Crusade and formed an alliance with Saladin, who held Jerusalem. And now elements in the West, powerful elements, leadership, and most likely the Pope, started to divert the Fourth Crusade into an attack on Constantinople. And John Godfrey describes how European nobility had no enthusiasm for this Fourth Crusade until Pope Innocent III threatened to put a 2.5% income tax on them if they stayed home. And so the knights, they weren't aware. They were forced to go on this, and most of the knights who went on this Fourth Crusade didn't know of this secret plan to attack Constantinople. And of course, this was carried out with the help of the Venetians and their giant fleet, which moved them there. And then So it took a long time for this giant fleet to get all the way to Constantinople. It took almost a year and a half to transport the whole army, and most of them didn't know where they were going. But by the time they got to Constantinople and they realized what they were doing, they realized that they were there to sack the city. Very few of the knights had any objection. The city of Constantinople was the biggest city of the medieval world. It was 7 miles long, 5 miles wide, population of about 1 million, had its own water supply, a lot of public parks, street lighting, good sewers, and but it was a city on the decline. The army, the native, things were degenerating into disorder. So then on April 9th, the Crusaders attacked and defeated the Byzantines. From April 13th to 15th, the Christian invaders returned loose on the greatest Christian city in the world. They went wild, sacking the city. They preserved the foolish relics, the bones of the saint, pieces of the cross, milk from the Mother of God, stuff that would have drawn more tourist attraction, and they destroyed the great artworks. Lots of statues made of gold, and it was all melted down into bullion or coins. Constantinople also had a great library of 120,000 volumes. A lot of this was left over from the Library of Alexandria as well. Zarlenga takes a moment to point out that books were incredibly expensive back then. It's estimated that a single medical volume cost the equivalent of 3 months' normal living expenses to create or to buy, and that the average legal book took about 16 months' worth of legal expenses. But on the positive side of this, in spite of a lot of books being burned, some of the greatest works of Greek philosophy, like that of Aristotle, which hadn't existed in Europe, was saved from Constantinople and brought back to the West. So the significance of this is that the monetary system of the Caesars has finally ended. And of course, this meant that with Byzantium, the loss of Byzantium and the Bacillus, the control of money slipped out of religious hands into secular hands. And so now, local rulers all over Europe were able to start minting gold. Initially, only the Pontificus Maximus and then the Basilius could do this. But now, local rulers started doing it. 1225, Frederick II. We see Henry III doing this in 1257. The Venetians mint their own in 1284. And it goes on. So the old world had fallen. This huge redistribution of metal back to Europe is what made the Renaissance possible. It's interesting, this sacking of Constantinople. Constantinople is fairly close to Troy, too. It's interesting to see this return of metal going back to Europe throughout history, every several centuries. Alexander the Great's conquests into Asia could almost be looked at as a forerunner of the Crusades, with the exception that he was clearly in it more for the adventure than for the gold, which is what this was about. So, it's written in here that the plunder of Constantinople by the Venetians and the Crusaders probably transferred more metallic wealth to Western Europe than all of the commerce of the centuries that preceded it. The hoarded coinage and bullion had been less useless in Constantinople. It was requiring heavy storage expenses, and it wasn't really being circulated. It wasn't paying for any kind of activity, any kind of art or trade. So, Knights Templar. Again, they formed right after the First Crusade, and ostensibly the purpose, they're formed in 1114 to 18, supposedly to protect pilgrims in the Holy Land. And of course, they had the half black, half white flag, made famous by Indiana Jones in The Last Crusade. But it's written in here that evidence suggests that this avowed purpose was a facade and that the knights were engaged in a much more ambitious, grandiose geopolitical design, according to Bennett and Millay, in their provocative book, The Temple and the Lodge. The Templars' original membership simply appears too high-powered and their growth too rapid. A lot of nobles, a lot of aristocracy involved in their original membership. And so within 1 year of coming about, they owned a ton of stuff. Oops, I'm going the wrong way. Land in pretty much all over Europe. And so this growth is hard to explain by the concept of merely protecting pilgrims, because there are other knight groups such as the Knights Hospitalier of St. John, which eventually evolved into the Red Cross. So, here's some more stuff that they own, but Zarlenga's explanation for the tremendous overnight growth of Europe, the way the Templars pretty much owned all of Europe within a year, is that they tapped into this east-west gold-silver trading mechanism. Travelers' checks to pilgrims, essentially. The pilgrim could give some silver to the Templar organization in Europe before they started their journey. That way they wouldn't have to carry it with them across the dangerous routes. And then they could get some gold, when they get to any of the sites in the Holy Lands. The travels of pilgrims and others to the reclaimed Holy Lands meant a tremendous transfer of funds for their expenses, but the pilgrims would rarely carry the coinage with them and relied on the Templars' facility to receive payment in Europe and then make payment to the pilgrims in the Holy Land. And this wasn't just like poor pilgrims doing this. I mean, these were like kings, like King Louis VII. So the Templars received payment from the Westerners in Europe in silver. They credited them in Jerusalem in gold, presumably at the Western gold-silver ratio of 12-1. But the silver the Templars collected in Europe could be exchanged for twice as much gold in India, where the ratio was usually around 7-1, potentially giving the Templars a huge profit on these monetary systems. So the Templars became the ones moving silver from west to east now. They did other stuff too. They probably made a lot of other money off this too. They're the ones that learned the financial arts from the East. Zarlenga talks about how this predates the Italian banking houses. In effect, the modern origins of banking can be attributed to the Order of the Temple. At the peak of their power, the Templars handled much, if not most, of the available capital in Western Europe. They pioneered the concept of credit facilities as well as the allocation of credit for commercial development and expansion. The Templars owned and ran the depository that held the French treasury in Paris. They collected the taxes for the crown, made loans to the French and English crowns. Between 1260 and 1266, Henry III pawned the British jewels with the Templars. Queen Eleanor personally brought them to the Templars' Paris Precipitory. So we see the Templars starting to own the kings, the monarchies of Europe. The popularity of the Templars became so great that scarce a will of importance was made without an article in it in the Templars' favor. Safe deposit keeping, also something that the Templars pioneered. Loans, big loans to government. Traveler's checks, we covered that. So they got too powerful too quickly. On Friday the 13th, in October 1307, King Philip of France had the Templars arrested throughout the realm with secret sealed orders to all departments, which were opened at the time and acted upon immediately. There were an estimated 20,000 Templars in Europe at this time, 10% of them being fighting knights, but the Templars offered no resistance. They were interrogated over a period of years, and many were tortured and killed. This bloody episode illustrates an important monetary principle that financiers sometimes forget. Ultimately, in extreme conditions, political power is superior to the monetary power. It proved impossible to find a formula to bring them under papal control, and in 1312 the Pope, under Philip's influence, dissolved their charter and turned over their possessions to the Knights of St. John. Their leader, Jacques de Molay, a Burgundian, was burned at the stake, and he called for Pope Clement VI and King Philip to join him within the year, and they were both died under suspicious circumstances within that year, and perhaps insinuated by other Templars, it would seem. Another mystery is that the Templars' treasury disappeared just before the 1307 raid at the Paris Templary. The treasury left with many pack horses. The treasurers left with many pack horses, and they embarked on the 18 ships that they had, and they completely vanished with their treasure. Bagnet and Lee believe that they found refuge in Kilmartin in Scotland, whose leader, Bruce, was already excommunicated by the papacy. And they suspect that the Templars helped Bruce win a war, which helped them found the Stuart line, which ruled Great Britain until 1688. The Templars finding refuge in Scotland may explain why Scotland was also later the origin of so many banking innovations and schemers, such as William Patterson, John Law, and others, even Adam Smith assembling the wealth of nations in the Scottish village from 1773 to 1776, wrote that Scottish banking was dominating the world. It would be in Scotland that the mutual fund was first invented and made public. It was also through the Templars that the Holy Grail romances came into being. They served as an example of chivalry in action, and the theme of an infirm ruler with the land laid to waste and a knight in search of the Grail still provides a formula for heroic action today. Zarlenga also writes, and this is where the conspiratorial kind of stuff starts to come in, we'll end here, that the Templars later surfaced in some of the Freemason lodges. They're underground, and the papacy continued to hunt them down. But Zarlenga suspects that the Knights Templar were an important factor in the Magna Carta, England's great document of liberty in the 13th century. Their descendants, the Freemasons, were important in the French Revolution, in the unification of Italy, and most importantly in the American Revolution. Benjamin Franklin apparently was America's best-known Freemason, and he was the Grand Master of the Lodge in Pennsylvania from 1734. Of 56 signatories to the Declaration of Independence, 9 were definitely Freemasons, and perhaps 10 more. 74 general officers in the Continental Army, 33 were Freemasons as well, according to Bennett and Lee. It was largely through the lodges that they learned the lofty premise called the rights of man. It was through the lodges that they learned the concepts of the perfectibility of society. So the importance of the Crusades and how this proliferated out all the way up into the American Revolution. And we can start to see the beginnings of modern banking from the Crusades. So that's all I got for tonight. It's pretty late. Are there any questions or anything? Any comments? No, didn't think so. That's cool. We'll end there. And remember to check out Greens for Monetary Reform. You can find links to all the lecture materials here. I'm going to post this lecture on Greens for Monetary Reform, our YouTube channel. And please hit my GoFundMe page as well. I'll post another link to my GoFundMe. If you like this lecture, please support it. We'll keep more of this good history coming. Thanks a lot.
Yeah.